The 4th of June, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm over the vast Pacific Ocean, where death would soon arrive on wings of fire and metal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the massive battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed toward the horizon, where Midway Atoll lay hidden beyond the curve of the earth. What the brilliant Japanese commander did not know, what he could not know, was that every movement of his carefully orchestrated fleet had already been observed, analyzed, and countered by enemies he believed were still fumbling in darkness. The greatest naval battle of the Pacific War was about to unfold, and the hunters had already become the hunted. 6 months had passed since the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the sleeping American giant into a roaring beast, hungry for revenge. Yamamoto himself had warned his superiors that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. And now that prophecy hung heavy in the salt-laden air. According to declassified naval intelligence documents from the National Archives, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had achieved what seemed impossible. They had cracked the Japanese Navy's communication codes and read their most secret battle plans as clearly as morning newspapers. The Japanese strategy for Midway appeared flawless on paper. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the mobile strike force, steaming toward the tiny atoll with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same steel leviathans that had devastated Pearl Harbor. Behind them came the main body under Yamamoto himself, including the mighty Yamato with her 18-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing more than automobiles. Still further came the invasion transports carrying 5,000 soldiers meant to seize Midway and establish a forward base that would threaten Hawaii itself. But the Americans were not where Yamamoto expected them to be. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the calm Texan who commanded the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters overlooking Pearl Harbor's still-scarred waters, had positioned his forces with surgical precision. Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, already lurked northeast of Midway under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Task Force 17, centered on the carrier Yorktown, hastily repaired after damage at Coral Sea that should have taken months to fix, waited nearby under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The Japanese search planes launched at dawn on the 4th of June, cut through clouds and scanned empty ocean, their pilots reporting nothing but endless blue water. Nagumo paced the bridge of Akagi, confident but cautious. His first strike wave of 108 aircraft had already departed for Midway itself, carrying bombs meant to soften the island's defenses before the invasion. His reserve aircraft sat on his carrier's hangar decks, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically designed to destroy enemy warships, if any appeared. At Midway Atoll itself, radar operators stared at their green screens as countless Japanese aircraft appeared like a swarm of mechanical locusts. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort's intelligence had predicted this moment with eerie accuracy, giving Midway's defenders precious hours to prepare. Every available American aircraft on the island scrambled skyward to meet the threat, knowing they were vastly outnumbered, but determined to buy time for the carrier forces to strike. The stage was set for a battle that would pivot on minutes and miles, where information would prove more valuable than armor plate, and where men who searched desperately for enemies would die without ever knowing those enemies had found them first. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific as American patrol planes from Midway executed their predetermined search patterns, their crews scanning the ocean's surface with binoculars and trained eyes that could distinguish a ship's wake from a whitecap at distances that seemed impossible. At exactly 5:52 in the morning on that fateful 4th of June, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a lumbering PBY Catalina flying boat on the northernmost search leg, spotted something that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Ships, dozens of them, stretched across the ocean like a steel armada from ancient legend. His radio crackled to life. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150 miles. Minutes later, as Japanese bombers and fighters roared toward Midway in disciplined formations, another American search plane confirmed what Nimitz had gambled everything to achieve. Japanese carriers had been located. The message flashed across hundreds of miles. 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, Distance 180 miles. Course 135. Speed 25 knots. According to accounts preserved in Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, this intelligence allowed American commanders to position their forces with deadly precision, while Japanese scouts still searched empty ocean quadrants. Aboard Akagi, Nagumo received troubling reports from his Midway strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, requesting a second attack wave to suppress the island's defenses, which had proven more resilient than anticipated. This created a dilemma that would haunt Japanese naval strategists for generations. Nagumo's reserve aircraft sat ready to attack enemy warships, but Midway still threatened his fleet. At 7:15, he made a fateful decision: rearm the reserve aircraft with land attack bombs for a second strike against Midway. Ordnance crews swarmed through the carrier's hangar decks, frantically removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, stacking them carelessly on deck edges to save precious time. Then at 7:28, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems, finally reported American ships to the northeast. Nagumo's blood chilled. Ships? What ships? He ordered the scout to ascertain ship types, but agonizing minutes passed in radio silence. The Japanese admiral stood frozen between two terrible choices: complete the rearming for Midway, or reverse the process again to attack possible American carriers. At 7:45, the delayed confirmation arrived like a death sentence. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo immediately ordered his ordnance crews to rearm yet again with anti-ship weapons, but the damage was done. His hangar decks became chaos as exhausted sailors struggled to move heavy munitions in opposite directions. Fuel lines snaked across decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed rather than secured in magazines. The carrier force that had seemed invincible now transformed into floating ammunition dumps waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, Fletcher and Spruance aboard their American carriers had already launched their strike aircraft, based on the morning search reports. Commander John Waldron led Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 toward the Japanese fleet, his 15 Devastator torpedo bombers flying low and slow, vulnerable as pregnant ducks. Enterprise and Yorktown launched their own squadrons in coordinated waves, though radio communication problems and navigational errors would scatter the American attack across miles of empty ocean. The Japanese combat air patrol fighters, the legendary Zero fighters that dominated Pacific skies with their maneuverability and experienced pilots, orbited above Nagumo's carriers, waiting for threats that American intelligence had already vectored toward them. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led these defenders, confident in their aircraft's superiority and his pilot's skill. They had trained for this moment, practiced interception techniques until they could execute them in sleep. But they had never faced an enemy who already knew their position while they still searched for his. The pieces moved across the vast chessboard of the Pacific, and every move the Japanese made had been anticipated, countered, and exploited by opponents they had underestimated. The 29th minute past 9 o'clock brought horror from a cloudless sky as Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 spotted the Japanese carrier force's telltale wakes, cutting white paths across the blue Pacific. Waldron, a part Sioux warrior from South Dakota, who had once told his wife he would not survive this war, waggled his wings and dove toward the enemy, his 14 wingmen following in tight formation, despite knowing their obsolete Douglas Devastators carried them toward almost certain death. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, designed in 1934, lumbered through the air at barely 115 miles per hour when carrying their Mark 13 torpedoes, weapons so unreliable that American submariners cursed them as often as they fired them. Japanese Zero fighters fell upon Waldron's squadron like hawks among pigeons. The combat air patrol, vectored perfectly by Nagumo's fighter directors, attacked from above and behind where the American gunners could barely return fire. According to survivor testimony recorded in Gordon Prange's comprehensive work Miracle at Midway, the Japanese pilots showed no mercy and needed none. Their nimble fighters danced around the wallowing American torpedo planes, 20mm cannons shredding aluminum skin and flesh with equal ease. One by one, the Devastators tumbled into the ocean trailing smoke and flame. Waldron's aircraft exploded first, cartwheeling into the sea with all hands lost. Ensign George Gay, the last surviving pilot, pressed his attack until his own aircraft shuddered under Japanese fire. His gunner killed instantly, his controls shot away. Gay's Devastator crashed into the Pacific, and he swam away from his sinking aircraft, hiding under his seat cushion floating on the surface, watching the battle unfold from the water, while Japanese destroyers churned past, their crews too focused on the air battle to notice one American floating among the debris. Not one torpedo from Torpedo Squadron 8 struck its target. 15 aircraft launched, 1 man survived. But Waldron's sacrifice had not been meaningless. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol now orbited at wave-top level, their pilots' adrenaline pumping, their fuel gauges dropping, all their attention focused downward where torpedo bombers attacked. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 and Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived minutes later and suffered identical fates. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Enterprise's torpedo bombers into the same killing zone, and the Zeros ripped them apart with mechanical efficiency. 10 of 14 aircraft fell burning into the ocean. Lindsay himself died in the attack, along with most of his squadron. Aboard the Japanese carriers, Nagumo's officers breathed carefully measured sighs of relief. The Americans had revealed themselves and launched uncoordinated suicidal attacks that accomplished nothing. The 4 Japanese carriers still steamed in perfect formation, undamaged, their decks now finally cleared of the rearming chaos as the last aircraft were prepared for launch. Mechanics gave thumbs-up signals, pilots climbed into cockpits. In minutes, a massive Japanese counterstrike would launch toward the American carriers, and the Pacific War's momentum would shift decisively back toward Tokyo. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey circled high above broken clouds, fuel gauges in his 33 Enterprise dive bombers reading dangerously low. McCluskey had led his squadron on an expanding search pattern after missing the Japanese fleet at its predicted location, gambling precious fuel that his pilots would need for the long flight back to Enterprise. Some squadron commanders would have turned back. McCluskey pressed on, following his instinct and a lone Japanese destroyer steaming northward at full speed. The Arashi, which had dropped back to depth charge a suspected American submarine. Then McCluskey saw them. 4 Japanese carriers arranged in a box formation, their decks packed with aircraft being prepared for launch. From 17,000 feet, the carriers looked like perfect toys, their red circle insignias clearly visible. McCluskey rolled into his dive, and 33 Dauntless dive bombers followed, screaming down at 250 miles per hour, targeting Kaga and Akagi while the Japanese Combat Air Patrol circled uselessly at sea level, their pilots unaware that death dove from above. At almost the same instant, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown into their own dives, targeting Soryu. The Japanese had searched for American carriers all morning, sent scout planes across thousands of square miles of ocean, launched defensive fighters that had decimated the American torpedo squadrons. But they had never looked up at the precise moment when vengeance arrived from the sun. The 24th minute past 10 o'clock in the morning shattered the Japanese Navy's invincibility in fragments of burning steel and shredded dreams. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Enterprise's bombing squadron in his screaming dive toward Akagi, watched through his bomb sight as Nagumo's flagship grew larger with terrifying speed, every detail crystallizing. Aircraft spotted on deck, sailors running for cover, anti-aircraft guns traversing desperately upward. Best's 1,000-pound bomb released at 1,500 feet, and he pulled out of his dive so hard that gray fog crept across his vision from the G-forces. Behind him, his bomb struck Akagi just behind the carrier's midship elevator, punching through the flight deck and detonating among aircraft being fueled and armed for launch. The explosion ignited a cascade of secondary detonations that transformed Akagi from a warship into a funeral pyre in seconds. Fuel from ruptured aircraft tanks spread liquid fire across the hangar deck. The torpedoes and bombs that had been so carelessly stacked during the morning's frantic rearming operations cooked off in sequential blasts that buckled steel plates and sent flaming debris spiraling into the sky. According to accounts compiled by Japanese naval historians Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya in their post-war analysis Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, Crewmen throughout Akagi's engineering spaces felt the carrier shudder from repeated internal explosions, heard the screams of trapped shipmates echoing through ventilation ducts, smelled the acrid stench of burning aviation fuel mixed with roasting human flesh. Simultaneously, other American dive bombers found Kaga with equal precision. The veteran carrier that had served since 1928 absorbed 4 direct bomb hits within 2 minutes. One bomb exploded among aircraft on the flight deck, creating an instant inferno. Another penetrated to the upper hangar deck, igniting stored munitions. A third struck near the forward elevator, jamming it in the raised position and creating a chimney that fed the fires below with fresh oxygen. The fourth hit devastated the bridge, killing most of Kaga's senior officers instantly, and leaving the burning carrier without effective command. Just 5 miles distant, Yorktown's dive bombers executed their attack on Soryu with textbook precision. 3 bombs struck within 2 minutes, and like her sister carriers, Soryu's hastily rearmed aircraft and exposed munitions created an explosive chain reaction. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, a samurai in all but name, stood on his bridge watching flames consume his command, refusing all entreaties to abandon ship, even as the carrier's steel bones groaned and twisted from the heat. Crewmen who survived reported hearing their captain singing the Japanese national anthem as flames engulfed the bridge. In less than 5 minutes, 300 seconds that naval strategists would study for the next 8 decades, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers had been transformed from feared weapons into blazing wrecks. The attack that Nagumo had prepared all morning would never launch. The aircraft that should have struck the American carriers burned on decks or plunged into the sea as their carriers listed and lost steerage. The carefully trained pilots who represented years of rigorous selection and training died in their cockpits or leaped into the ocean to escape the flames. Aboard Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi immediately grasped the catastrophe and ordered an immediate counterstrike. Unlike Nagumo, who had transferred his flag to a light cruiser after Akagi became uninhabitable, Yamaguchi remained in tactical command. His carrier's aircraft had been held in reserve, and he had maintained some ready aircraft on deck despite the morning's confusion. At 10:54, Yamaguchi launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, everything immediately available, toward the American carriers whose position had finally been reported with accuracy. The American task forces had not escaped detection. Japanese search planes had finally located Fletcher's carriers, and now Yamaguchi's strike aircraft bore down on them with pilots consumed by rage and determination to avenge their burning comrades. The hunters had become the hunted, but Hiryu still represented a deadly threat, her experienced air crew capable of dealing devastating blows despite being outnumbered. Enterprise and Hornet, having recovered their returning aircraft, steamed outside Hiryu's search radius. But Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, the carrier that had absorbed 3 months of repairs in 3 days to join this battle, now found herself alone and vulnerable as Japanese aircraft appeared on radar screens at 34 miles distance. The carrier's Combat Information Center erupted in controlled chaos, as fighter directors vectored defending Wildcats toward the incoming threat while Yorktown herself heeled into evasive turns, working up to 30 knots, her engineering crews coaxing maximum speed from boilers that had been declared unrepairable weeks earlier. The noon hour brought death wrapped in the rising sun insignia, as Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi's 18 dive bombers from Hiryu penetrated Yorktown's combat air patrol through a combination of skill, determination, and the inevitable gaps in fighter coverage that appeared when defending a single carrier against a concentrated attack. Yorktown's 5-inch anti-aircraft guns hammered the sky with black puffs of explosive shells, while 20mm and 40mm guns created a steel curtain through which the Japanese pilots dove with samurai courage, their aircraft shuddering from hits but pressing attacks nonetheless. Half of Kobayashi's aircraft died in flames before reaching their release points, tumbling into the Pacific or exploding in midair, but the survivors dove through the defensive fire with precision that demonstrated their years of training. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first exploded on the flight deck, penetrating to the hangar deck and igniting 3 armed aircraft. The second hit devastated the carrier's uptakes, the massive funnels that carried boiler exhaust, extinguishing 5 of 6 boilers and reducing Yorktown's speed to 6 knots within minutes. The third bomb exploded deep inside the ship, starting fires that damage control parties attacked with desperate courage, while smoke filled compartments and the carrier wallowed dead in the water. According to damage control reports preserved in the Naval Historical Center archives, Yorktown's crew demonstrated extraordinary skill and bravery, containing fires that should have consumed the entire ship, maintaining watertight integrity despite severe structural damage, and preparing to restart boilers even as their carrier lay vulnerable under clear skies. Admiral Fletcher, his flagship transformed from a weapon into a target, transferred command to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise at 1300 hours. The tactical situation had crystallized with cruel clarity. 3 Japanese carriers burned while 1 American carrier lay crippled, and somewhere to the west, Hiryu still operated with a full complement of torpedo bombers that had not yet launched. Spruance, the quiet cruiser admiral commanding carriers for the first time in combat, understood that Hiryu represented an existential threat that must be eliminated immediately. Meanwhile, aboard the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo had watched his proud mobile strike force disintegrate in minutes. The admiral who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had rampaged through the East Indies and Indian Ocean destroying everything before him, now stood on a cruiser's deck watching black smoke columns mark where his carriers died. At 14:30, Nagumo ordered Akagi's survivors to abandon ship, and her captain, Taijiro Aoki, prepared the carrier for scuttling rather than allow her to fall into enemy hands. Sailors wept openly as they climbed down ropes into rescue boats, leaving shipmates trapped below decks where fires raged beyond control. Kaga had already sunk at 1900 hours, taking 800 crewmen to the bottom. Soryu would follow at 1913, Captain Yanagamoto still aboard, his figure last seen standing at attention on the bridge as flames consumed him. But Hiryu remained operational, and at 1431, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi launched his final strike, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, every remaining attack aircraft he possessed. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning strike against Midway and returned to report his aircraft damaged and leaking fuel, volunteered to lead this attack despite knowing he lacked fuel for the return journey. It would be a one-way mission for one of Japan's finest naval aviators. Yorktown's damage control teams had performed miracles. By 1500 hours, they had restored power to critical systems, extinguished major fires, patched holes in the flight deck with steel plates, and restarted 3 boilers. The carrier was making 19 knots when radar detected Hiryu's torpedo bombers 46 miles out. Fighter directors scrambled every available Wildcat, but the depleted combat air patrol could not prevent determined attackers from breaking through. Tomonaga's torpedo bombers attacked in a classic anvil formation, splitting to approach from both port and starboard bows simultaneously, forcing Yorktown's captain to choose which group to turn toward, inevitably exposing his ship's vulnerable flank to the other group. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed half the attackers, but 5 Type 97 torpedo bombers bore in to point-blank range and released their weapons. Torpedoes churned white wakes through blue water, and Yorktown's captain ordered emergency turns that twisted the carrier through increasingly tight circles. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side within seconds, their 700-pound warheads exploding against the carrier's hull with hammer blows that rattled teeth throughout the ship. The explosions opened massive holes below the waterline, and the Pacific Ocean flooded into engineering spaces, drowning men at their posts and extinguishing boilers that had just been restarted. Yorktown immediately took on a 17-degree list that threatened to capsize her, but damage control teams counter-flooded starboard compartments with calculated precision, deliberately drowning additional spaces to keep their carrier upright. The 17th hour of that fateful 4th of June found Enterprise and Hornet launching the strike that would complete the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation's elite. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, while Hornet contributed 16 more, all converging on coordinates where American search planes had finally located Hiryu, steaming desperately westward, her decks cleared for immediate launch of any returning aircraft, her crew working frantically to prepare a third strike wave that might yet salvage something from catastrophe. Hiryu's captain, Tomeo Kaku, maintained course and speed, despite knowing American dive bombers must be searching for him, gambling that minutes saved now might mean the difference between launching another attack or dying helplessly under American bombs. At 17:03, Enterprise's dive bombers found their target. Hiryu twisted through violent, evasive turns, her anti-aircraft guns creating a wall of steel and explosive shells that destroyed 2 American aircraft before they could dive. But 22 dauntless bombers screamed down from the sun's glare, and 4 bombs struck the Japanese carrier in rapid succession. 1 bomb exploded on the forward elevator, jamming it and preventing any further aircraft operations. The second hit penetrated to the hangar deck, where it detonated among armed and fueled aircraft, creating the same catastrophic chain reaction that had consumed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. A third bomb struck amidships, starting uncontrollable fires that spread through ventilation systems and consumed oxygen faster than damage control parties could seal compartments. The fourth bomb hit near the bridge, killing key officers and destroying communications equipment. According to accounts preserved in Japanese naval archives, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi initially refused to abandon his carrier, ordering damage control parties to fight fires while engineering crews attempted to maintain steam pressure. But Hiryu's wounds proved mortal. Fires spread despite heroic efforts to contain them, consuming compartments one after another, the heat so intense that steel plates glowed red and buckled. Fuel from ruptured aircraft tanks created rivers of liquid fire that flowed down companionways and ignited everything combustible. Ammunition cooked off in rolling explosions that killed damage control parties attempting to reach the flames. At 200 hours on the 5th of June, 1942, with Hiryu still burning but stubbornly refusing to sink, Yamaguchi assembled surviving officers and crew on the carrier's listing deck. The admiral, a brilliant tactician who had argued against the Midway operation, stood straight despite exhaustion and smoke inhalation. He composed farewell messages to Combined Fleet Headquarters, accepting full responsibility for the disaster. Then Yamaguchi ordered all surviving personnel to abandon ship, while he and Captain Kaku remained aboard to share their carrier's fate. Sailors wept openly as they climbed into lifeboats, watching their admiral stand at attention on Hiryu's bridge as flames illuminated him like a funeral pyre. Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into Hiryu's hull at 900 hours on the 5th of June, sending the last of the Kido Butai's 4 carriers to the bottom, with Yamaguchi and Kaku still aboard, both officers choosing death over the shame of survival. With them died Japan's realistic hope of victory in the Pacific War. The mobile strike force that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier, that had destroyed Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific and Indian Oceans, now lay scattered across the ocean floor northeast of Midway. Meanwhile, Yorktown refused to die. Despite 2 torpedo hits and 3 bomb strikes, despite fires and flooding and a list that should have capsized her, despite being abandoned by her crew on the 4th of June's evening, the carrier remained stubbornly afloat through the night. Captain Elliot Buckmaster led salvage parties back aboard on the 5th of June, and damage control teams achieved miracles. They pumped out flooded compartments, brought the list to 2 degrees, extinguished remaining fires, and had nearly succeeded in saving their carrier when the Japanese submarine I-168, prowling the battle area searching for targets, spotted the crippled flat top being towed toward Pearl Harbor. Commander Yahachi Tanabe maneuvered I-168 into perfect attack position at 13:31 on the 6th of June and fired 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown, and a third hit the destroyer Hammond, which was tied alongside providing power and pumping support. Hammond broke in half and sank in 4 minutes, her depth charges exploding as she went down, killing sailors in the water from concussion. Yorktown absorbed 2 more torpedo hits that finally proved fatal, opening her hull to the sea beyond any repair team's ability to save her. At dawn on the 7th of June, Yorktown rolled onto her port side and slipped beneath the Pacific, taking her battle flags with her, but leaving her crew largely saved. She had fought to the last possible moment, allowing her men time to escape. Of her 2,000-plus crew, only 141 died, a testament to damage control skill and leadership under impossible conditions. She had absorbed more punishment than any carrier in the battle and had given American forces precious hours to locate and destroy Hiryu. The 5th of June, 1942 dawned with Admiral Yamamoto, confronting a reality that shattered every assumption upon which Japan's Pacific strategy rested. The commander who had predicted Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but could make no promises beyond that. Now faced his worst nightmare. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, 100 aircraft lost, 2,500 irreplaceable trained pilots and aircrew dead, and the American carrier force still operational somewhere east of Midway. Yamamoto stood in Yamato's operations room, studying charts that showed his widely dispersed forces scattered across thousands of square miles of ocean, none positioned to influence the battle that had already been decided by American codebreakers and dive bomber pilots. Yamamoto's initial reaction revealed his aggressive nature. He ordered all available forces to converge on the Midway area for a night surface engagement where his battleship's superior firepower might yet salvage victory from disaster. His battle plan called for illumination rounds fired at American carriers to blind defending fighter pilots, while Japanese battleships closed to point-blank range and destroyed the American flat-tops with main battery fire. The light cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, approaching Midway from the southwest, received orders to bombard the atoll's installations before dawn, suppressing American aircraft that might interfere with the planned night action. But reality intervened with cruel efficiency. Mogami and Mikuma, executing violent evasion turns to avoid a reported American submarine, collided in darkness, severely damaging both cruisers and reducing their speed to 12 knots. The submarine USS Tambor had not actually attacked. Her captain merely observed the Japanese ships, but his presence triggered the collision that would doom both cruisers. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's scattered forces could not concentrate quickly enough for the planned night attack, and as dawn approached, the admiral faced an increasingly obvious truth. His forces were now vulnerable to land-based American bombers from Midway, and the American carrier forces, still intact despite Yorktown's damage, could strike again at will. Admiral Spruance, commanding the American carrier forces after Fletcher's transfer from the damaged Yorktown, demonstrated the caution and tactical insight that would define his career. Rather than pursue Yamamoto's retreating forces westward into waters where Japanese battleships might engage his carriers at night, Spruance maintained his position northeast of Midway during the night of the 4th to 5th of June, then turned west at dawn to launch searches for crippled Japanese ships that might not have escaped. According to accounts in Thomas Hughes's biography, Admiral Bill Halsey, A Naval Life, Spruance's decision to avoid night surface action frustrated some officers who wanted aggressive pursuit, but his caution preserved the carriers that had won the battle and prevented Yamamoto from achieving the surface engagement he desperately needed. At 230 hours on the 5th of June, Yamamoto transmitted the order that acknowledged defeat. The Midway operation is canceled. His forces would retire westward toward the safety of Japanese-controlled waters, while American forces, he hoped, would not pursue too aggressively. But Yamamoto's hopes for an orderly retreat evaporated when American search planes from Midway located the damaged cruisers Mogami and Mikuma limping westward, leaving oil slicks that marked their passage as clearly as blood and watermarks wounded prey for circling sharks. Over the next 2 days, American dive bombers from Midway and from Enterprise conducted repeated strikes against the crippled cruisers. Mikuma, absorbing multiple bomb hits on the 6th of June, lost speed and gradually settled lower in the water as fires spread and her crew abandoned ship. She sank that evening, taking 700 crewmen with her, her hull broken by internal explosions that tore apart magazines and engineering spaces. Mogami, despite severe damage that killed 90 crewmen and left her barely maneuverable, somehow survived the repeated attacks and limped back to Truk, then to Japan, where she would spend a year in repair yards being rebuilt. The human cost of Midway exceeded mere numbers. Japan lost 3,577 men, pilots, aircrew, ship crews, and the elite maintenance personnel who kept carrier operations functioning smoothly. These losses could never be replaced, not with Japan's limited industrial capacity and pilot training programs that emphasized quality over quantity. The United States lost 347 men, a tragic toll, but one representing barely 10% of Japanese losses, and losses that America's vast industrial and training base could replace within months. But the strategic implications dwarfed even these casualties. Japan's offensive capacity in the Pacific had been shattered in 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks. The Kido Butai, that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months no longer existed as an effective force. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku remained operational, but they could not project power alone, and Japan's shipbuilding capacity meant that replacement carriers would not arrive in meaningful numbers for more than a year. Behind the battle's smoke and fury lay a story of cryptanalytic brilliance that transformed American fortunes in the Pacific War, a story that would remain classified for decades after war's end, but which represented perhaps the most decisive intelligence triumph in naval history. Commander Joseph Rochefort, a disheveled genius who worked in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, had led the team that cracked Japanese naval codes and predicted the Midway attack with precision that seemed almost supernatural. This narrative draws from accounts preserved in Elliot Carlson's authoritative biography Joe Rochefort's War, which documented the intelligence breakthrough that gave Admiral Nimitz the advantage he needed to position his forces for ambush. Rochefort's team at Station Hypo, the code name for Combat Intelligence Unit Pacific Fleet, had been intercepting and partially decrypting Japanese naval communications since before Pearl Harbor. The Japanese used a code system designated JN-25 by American cryptanalysts, a complex cipher that changed elements periodically to maintain security. By May 1942, Rochefort's team could read perhaps 15% of intercepted messages, but that 15% included crucial operational details if analysts could interpret them correctly. Messages in late May repeatedly referenced AF, a location designated for a major operation, but identifying AF's actual location required creative thinking. Rochefort hypothesized that AF designated Midway Atoll based on traffic analysis and contextual clues, but he needed confirmation before Nimitz would commit his precious carriers to what might be a feint. The solution demonstrated Rochefort's brilliance. He arranged for Midway's garrison to send an unencrypted radio message reporting that the island's water desalination plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese radio intercepted by Station Hypo reported that AF is short of water. Rochefort had his confirmation, and Nimitz had the intelligence he needed to position Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway in perfect ambush position. Japanese intelligence failures compounded American successes. Japanese naval intelligence officers had convinced themselves that Yorktown had been sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, so when Nagumo's scout planes reported an American carrier northeast of Midway, the Japanese assumed it must be either Enterprise or Hornet, not realizing they faced 3 American carriers. Japanese intelligence had also grossly underestimated American code-breaking capabilities, assuming their codes remained secure despite traffic analysis suggesting otherwise. This combination of American insight and Japanese blindness created the conditions for catastrophic defeat. The Pearl Harbor Navy Yard's achievement in repairing Yorktown deserves special mention. The carrier had limped into Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May, with damage that naval architects estimated would require 3 months to repair properly. Admiral Nimitz gave them 3 days. 1,400 civilian yard workers swarmed aboard Yorktown, working around the clock in shifts that never stopped, cutting away damaged steel with torches, welding replacement plates, patching holes in the flight deck with concrete and steel beams, making her seaworthy if not fully repaired. Yorktown sortied on the 30th of May with yard workers still aboard, some of them remaining with the ship to complete repairs at sea while steaming toward Midway. This industrial and organizational achievement complemented the intelligence breakthrough perfectly. Nimitz had his carriers positioned precisely where they needed to be, with enough force to match or exceed Japanese strength, based on intelligence that told him when and where the enemy would strike. Japanese commanders, by contrast, operated in relative darkness, their intelligence services providing reassurances that American carriers remained in port or dispersed across the South Pacific, their operational plans based on assumptions rather than verified facts. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership proved as devastating as the physical losses. Yamamoto had designed the Midway operation partly to draw American carriers into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers and training would destroy them, finally achieving the strategic victory that would force American negotiators to accept Japanese dominance in the Western Pacific. Instead, the Americans had ambushed his ambushers, demonstrating that Japanese codes were compromised and that American intelligence capabilities far exceeded Tokyo's estimates. Every future operation would now proceed under the assumption that Americans might be reading Japanese plans, degrading the element of surprise that had been Japan's greatest tactical advantage. Rochefort's analysts continued working through the battle, tracking Japanese radio traffic and providing real-time updates on enemy movements. When Hiryu launched her strikes against Yorktown, Station Hypo's intercepts gave American commanders warning of the attacks, allowing them to vector fighter defenses more effectively. When Yamamoto ordered his scattered forces to converge for a night surface engagement, Rochefort's team detected the changed dispositions and warned Spruance, contributing to his decision to avoid pursuing westward into potential ambush. The intelligence war continued even after the carrier battle ended, with American codebreakers tracking the damaged cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, providing targeting information that enabled the devastating strikes on the 6th of June. Yet Rochefort received little recognition at the time. The Navy's bureaucratic politics intervened, with Washington-based intelligence officers claiming credit for the Midway prediction and minimizing Pearl Harbor's contribution. Rochefort would be denied the Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz recommended, transferred from Station Hypo in October 1942, and essentially sidelined for the remainder of the war. A shabby treatment of the man whose work had enabled America's most significant naval victory. Only decades later, in 1986, would Rochefort finally receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously, recognition that came 44 years too late for the brilliant cryptanalyst who had changed history. The intelligence lessons from Midway influenced the Pacific War's remainder profoundly. American codebreaking continued providing crucial advantages, including the intelligence that enabled the ambush and shooting down of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville in April 1943. Japanese forces never regained the initiative they had lost at Midway, fighting defensively for the war's remaining 3 years while American industrial might build the fleet that would island hop across the Pacific toward Tokyo. The battle also validated Admiral King's and Admiral Nimitz's strategic concept of carrier-based warfare, where information and strike capability mattered more than battleship firepower. Yamamoto's mighty Yamato, with her 18-inch guns and massive armor, never fired a shot at Midway. She remained too far from the action to influence events, a symbol of battleship obsolescence in the carrier age. The future belonged to the flat tops and the intelligence services that guided them, not to the dreadnoughts that had dominated naval thinking for 40 years. Japanese attempts to maintain operational security after Midway came too late. They changed code systems, tightened radio discipline, and implemented new communications procedures. But American cryptanalysts adapted to each change, maintaining partial reading capability throughout the war. The intelligence advantage gained at Midway persisted, compounding Japanese disadvantages as American forces advanced westward across the Pacific, island by island, carrier raid by carrier raid, always informed by intelligence that told them where Japanese forces deployed and when they moved. The Battle of Midway ended officially on the 7th of June, 1942, when Yorktown slipped beneath the waves, but its consequences rippled across the Pacific War's remaining 3 years and shaped naval strategy for generations afterward. Admiral Nimitz, in his official report to Admiral King, wrote that Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence, an unusually direct acknowledgement from a commander who understood that battles are won by preparation as much as by courage. The battle validated every assumption American strategic planners had made about carrier warfare, while destroying Japanese confidence in their tactical superiority and strategic invulnerability. Japan never recovered its offensive capability after Midway. The combined fleet retained significant strength. 6 fleet carriers remained operational or under construction, along with numerous light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, but the loss of trained aircrew proved irreplaceable. Japanese naval aviation had been an elite force built through rigorous selection that accepted only the most talented candidates, followed by training programs lasting years. The pilots who died at Midway represented Japan's seed corn, the instructors who should have trained the next generation, but instead perished in flaming aircraft or burning carriers. According to aviation historian Richard Frank's comprehensive analysis Tower of Skulls, Japanese carrier aviation never regained the proficiency level it possessed in December 1941 through June 1942. American industrial capacity, already vast, shifted into overdrive after Midway demonstrated that carriers decided Pacific battles. The Essex-class carriers, already under construction, received priority for completion. By 1943, new American carriers would be commissioning at a rate Japan could never match, one every 6 weeks at peak production. Casablanca-class escort carriers, built on merchant ship hulls, would eventually number 50 ships, providing anti-submarine protection, amphibious assault support, and aircraft ferry services that multiplied American operational flexibility. Japan, with its limited industrial base and resource constraints, could not compete in this production race. The battle's tactical lessons influenced naval aviation development for decades. Dive bombers had proven decisively effective when delivered with coordination and surprise, but torpedo bombers had been slaughtered when attacking without fighter escort or dive bomber support. The Navy accelerated development of the Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber to replace the obsolete Devastator, and insisted on better torpedoes after the Mark 13's continued reliability problems. Fighter development emphasized not just maneuverability, but also speed, range, and ruggedness, qualities where the Grumman Hellcat and later the Vought Corsair would surpass the Zero. Japanese tactical responses to Midway proved inadequate. They strengthened carrier damage control procedures, improved flight deck armor, and dispersed carrier formations more widely to prevent multiple ships from being caught in single attacks. But these modifications addressed symptoms rather than causes. Japan's fundamental problems, inadequate pilot training capacity, insufficient industrial production, and compromised communication security, remained unsolved because they were essentially unsolvable given Japan's resource limitations and the strategic overextension represented by its Pacific conquests. The strategic balance shifted decisively after Midway. American forces, no longer facing imminent threat to Hawaii or the West Coast, could assume offensive operations. Guadalcanal, the first major American amphibious counteroffensive, began just 2 months after Midway in August 1942. The Solomon Islands Campaign, New Guinea operations, Central Pacific island hopping, and eventually the Philippines liberation, all became possible because Midway had eliminated the Japanese carrier threat that might have interdicted American amphibious operations or struck American bases supporting those operations. Individual stories from Midway resonated through the war. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued by a Catalina flying boat on the 5th of June after spending 30 hours in the water, watching the battle unfold around him. He returned to combat, survived the war, and spent decades telling his squadron's story, ensuring that Waldron's sacrifice would not be forgotten. Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to continue searching when his fuel gauges read critically low, led directly to finding the Japanese carriers, received the Navy Cross, but always insisted his pilots deserved the credit. Spruance earned promotion to Vice Admiral and went on to command 5th Fleet through the Gilbert's Marshalls, Marianas, and Iwo Jima campaigns. Japanese survivors carried different memories. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and should have commanded Midway's airstrike but was hospitalized with appendicitis, watched his Navy's elite die from Akagi's deck. He survived to write detailed accounts of Japanese carrier operations, providing crucial insights into how Japan's Navy had functioned at its peak. The few pilots who survived, men who had flown from burning carriers or been rescued from the ocean, found themselves promoted to instructor positions where they struggled to train replacement pilots in months, rather than the years their own training had required. The battle shaped post-war naval doctrine profoundly. Every major navy studied Midway's lessons: the decisiveness of air power at sea, the vulnerability of surface ships to aerial attack, the crucial importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, the need for coordinated strike packages rather than piecemeal attacks, the value of damage control training. American carrier doctrine, refined through the war's remaining years, became the model that NATO navies would follow through the Cold War. The Soviet Navy, noting how carriers had dominated Pacific naval warfare, eventually built its own carrier force despite Russia's historical focus on submarines and land-based aviation, Midway also provided cautionary lessons about overconfidence and assumption-based planning. Japanese commanders had assumed American carriers were either in port or dispersed in the South Pacific. They had assumed their codes remained secure. They had assumed their tactical superiority would compensate for any surprises. Every assumption proved wrong, and these errors compounded into catastrophe. Modern military planners, studying Midway and war colleges worldwide, learned to question assumptions, verify intelligence, maintain operational security, and never underestimate opponents. The battle's human cost, 3,924 men killed in 4 days, represented more than statistics. Each casualty was someone's son, husband, brother, or father. American families in small towns across the country received telegrams regretfully informing them of losses. Japanese families received similar notifications, though often delayed by months as the Navy attempted to conceal the defeat's magnitude. The sacrifice of pilots like Waldron, who flew obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds because duty demanded it, represented the best of military service even as their deaths illustrated war's tragic waste. 78 years after the battle, Midway remains a touchstone for naval professionals and military historians. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans maintains extensive Midway exhibits. The Naval War College includes Midway as a core case study in its operational art curriculum. The sunken carriers, Yorktown discovered in 1998, Kaga in October 2019, and Akagi in October 2019, rest on the Pacific floor as war graves, protected by international treaty. Silent monuments to the men who fought there. The battle's ultimate significance transcended tactical victory or strategic advantage. Midway demonstrated that wars are won by nations, not just by warriors. Intelligence organizations breaking codes, shipyard workers repairing carriers in 72 hours, factory workers building aircraft, all contributed as essentially as the pilots who dove through anti-aircraft fire. Japan's defeat at Midway reflected not individual failure, but systemic disadvantages. Industrial capacity, resource availability, code-breaking capability, training capacity, that would have determined the war's outcome eventually regardless of tactical results. Midway simply accelerated the inevitable, shortening the war and saving countless lives that would have been lost in prolonged combat. Admiral Yamamoto, who survived Midway but died 11 months later when American fighters shot down his aircraft over Bougainville, reportedly told subordinates after the battle that Japan had lost the war's initiative and would never regain it. He was correct. The Japanese fleets that had searched for enemies on the morning of the 4th of June 1942 had failed to find opponents that American intelligence had already positioned for ambush. That failure, and the 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks that followed, changed the Pacific War's trajectory and demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side that sees first and strikes first often wins decisively, regardless of nominal force strengths or warrior spirit. The hunters had been hunted, and the balance of naval power had shifted from Tokyo to Pearl Harbor in the time it took for 37 dive bombers to scream down from the sun and plant their bombs with terrible precision.